Our next topic is nervous tissue. So we've looked at epithelial tissue and connective tissue. So make sure you're going back to review those. For nervous tissue, it's a really short section. There's not a lot we're going to get into right now because the end of this course includes 4 separate chapters over the nervous system. So let's just introduce nervous tissue. So the main component of the nervous system is nervous tissue. So we would find nervous tissue in the brain, the spinal cords, and your peripheral nerves. It makes up the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and it's a great communicating system made up of nervous tissue. Nervous tissue itself is able to regulate and control body functions via electrical signals called action potentials, and these action potentials can trigger the secretion of chemicals called neurotransmitters. There's 2 main types of cells that we find in nervous system organs, so this is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is made up of neurons and glial cells. Glial cells are also called neuroglial cells, but make sure that you don't confuse that with neurological, which is a term meaning pertaining to neurons or part of the nervous system. So again, neurons or glial cells, also called neuroglial cells. Neurons are going to be the main cell type. They're the ones that generate and conduct nerve impulses called action potentials. These are electrical signals that are transmitted from cell to cell. The cell body and the extensions from the cell body make up neurons. Those include things like the axons and the dendrites. Axons are the conducting regions that transmit electrical impulses of neurons. And then dendrites are cytoplasmic extensions from the cell body that respond to stimuli. They're going to accept impulses from neurotransmitters, for example. The glial cells are kind of like the glue that hold the nervous system together. So they're a type of nervous tissue that support the neurons and insulate and protect the really immature neurons as they grow. So here's a slide of nervous tissue. You can see the really big cells. These are neurons with central nuclei. They have several types of cell projections, including dendrites and axons. The cell body is generally called the soma, just another word that means cell body. And then you have all this fibrous material, and a lot of this fibrous material with these dots are the glial cells. Many of the glial cells, like astrocytes or microglial cells, are very branched. So again, we can see a singular neuron with a soma or cell body, a nucleus, short dendrites to receive a signal, and an axon to send that signal to the next neuron. You have plenty of branched glial cells, and you can see their nuclei kind of spread throughout. And that's it for nervous tissue. It really was short. We're not going to add a whole lot to that, again, because we have 4 chapters at the end of this course to look at the nervous system with. Next, we're going to look at muscle tissue. Now, muscle tissue is highly vascularized. It's also innervated, so there's nerves and blood vessels in muscle tissue. And it's responsible for most types of movements because muscle tissue contains myofilaments. The myofilaments are actin and myosin. These are small protein filaments found within muscle cells that when you bring them closer together or slide them past each other, cause contraction. And in Chapter 9, we are going to look at the process or physiology of muscle contraction, and then we'll look at muscles in Chapter 10. So this is really just an introduction or an overview. There are 3 types of muscle tissue: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth, and we're going to look at each one. So let's do some basic introduction here. You have skeletal muscle, which is made up of long cylindrical cells. You have cardiac muscle, which is made up of similar looking cells to skeletal muscle, but its cells are branched. You also have smooth muscle, which is made up of spindle-shaped cells. And what spindle-shaped cells means is you have a cell with a central nucleus that's really fat in the middle and skinny on the ends. It's also called a fusiform-shaped cell. Both skeletal and cardiac muscle are striated, meaning that the arrangement of its myofilaments causes the appearance of stripes. Smooth muscle, hence its name, does not have stripes, does not have any striations. Skeletal muscle is the only type of muscle that is multinucleate. Every once in a while you may see a cardiac muscle cell with 2 nuclei, but it's mainly uninucleate, just like smooth muscle, which is also uninucleate. So we could start to put these muscle tissues in categories. For example, if I said, which 2 types of muscle tissue have stripes, have striations? You would want to say skeletal and cardiac muscle. How about if I ask which type of tissue doesn't have striations? That would be smooth muscle. You could have a question that asks about the number of nuclei, and you want to make sure you know that skeletal muscle is the only one that has more than one nucleus. The rest are uninucleate. We can also talk about the action of this muscle. Of course, it's contraction, but is it voluntary or involuntary? Well, skeletal muscle is the only muscle that contracts voluntarily. The others are under involuntary control by the nervous system. For example, you never have to think about, oh, I need to tell my heart to beat, or I need to tell my stomach to send food to my smooth intestine by contracting. That's because smooth muscle contraction and cardiac muscle contraction are under involuntary control. Whereas if you were in class and you had a question and you needed to raise your hand, you would need to think about raising your hand in order for that action to occur. So before we really get into it, let's look at these different arrangements or photomicrographs, and we have the 3 cell types. Now, one of these is teased smooth muscle, and I know one is labeled, but just hang with me. If we were comparing these pictures and all we had to go off of was the descriptions of skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle, we would say, well, these cells have stripes, so it's not smooth muscle. Looking at these cells, we see these dark stripes. So at the very least, it's not smooth muscle, but what are these dark stripes? We're going to get to that. And over here, we have a teased type of cell. So this is not how the muscle would normally look. But we have a dark nucleus here. It's kind of thread-like, really thin on the ends, a little bit denser in the middle. So this one must be smooth. We have the fusiform or spindle-shaped cells. Slightly bulging in the middle. I know it's not a lot, probably not what you pictured. But really thin on the ends. So smooth muscle cells are thread-like. They're really small. They're skinny. Whereas this must be skeletal muscle because we have long cylindrical cells and a lot of nuclei. And skeletal muscle was multinucleate. And then down here we can see these dark bands. These dark bands are intercalated discs. You can only find these dark bands in a type of striated tissue, and that type of striated tissue would be cardiac muscle. And these are going to contain desmosomes and gap junctions that help hold cardiac muscle tissue together. The gap junctions also are going to be able to move ions from one cardiac muscle cell to another, and that allows for the functionality of the heart, wherein you would find cardiac muscle. It allows the heart to beat as a unit, or in functional synctium. So let's just go over that real quick. Long cylindrical cells are skeletal muscle cells. Spindle or fusiform shaped cells are smooth. And cells that are slightly branched but still long and cylindrical, those are going to be cardiac cells, but they also contain intercalated discs, which have specialized cell junctions, which hold the cells together and allow them to beat as a unit. And that's going to be our basis for muscle tissue. And of course, we're going to eventually go through chapters that cover each one of those in more detail. But let's finish off this course looking at membranes that cover in line, and then also looking at tissue repair. So a membrane is going to be made up of not only multicellular sheets, but 2 types of tissue. And normally the 2 types of tissue that make up a membrane is a layer of epithelium with an underlying layer of connective tissue. So you have cutaneous membranes, mucous membranes, and serous membranes. And we won't do serous membranes too much here, because you've already talked about them in Chapter 1. Serous membranes have 2 layers, a visceral and parietal layer. The visceral layer is going to be closer to the organ. The parietal layer is going to be closer to the body cavity. We have 3 types of serous membranes, a pleura, pericardium, or peritoneum. Pleura is plural for the pleura, which cover the lungs. Pericardium encloses the heart, and the peritoneum encloses the abdominal pelvic viscera. The function of serous membranes is to secrete a serous fluid between the layers to reduce friction between areas that could rub together to prevent inflammation. And that's pretty much it for serous membranes for review. So let's go back to cutaneous and mucous membranes. The cutaneous membrane is made up of the skin, specifically the epidermis attached to the dermis. So your integument, that's essentially the cutaneous membrane. The epidermis is epithelial tissue, the dermis is connective tissue. Then you have mucous membranes. These are usually wet or moist membranes that line all body cavities. These are generally going to line open body cavities, as opposed to, say, the closed ventral body cavities wherein you would find serous membranes. So again, cutaneous membrane is your integument. It's exposed to air. It's a dry membrane as opposed to a mucous membrane, which is a wet membrane. You could also call mucous membranes mucosa, and that refers to location, not really the cell composition. So mucosa could be made up of epithelial and connective, or just one, depending on what you're talking about. A lot of the mucosas are stratified squamous or simple columnar epithelium, underlined with lamina propria, which is usually a loose type of connective tissue, usually areolar. Some even have a deeper third layer, it's a smooth muscle layer, and so others may have some fat around that smooth muscle layer. So again, your cutaneous membrane is a dry membrane, it's your skin. That's epidermis and dermis, or epithelial and connective tissue included. Then you have mucous membranes, which are a wet membrane. They are going to be found in open body cavities. And then your serous membranes, we went through, we reviewed. You had the 2 layers, we had different names for the ones in different locations. More information was also available in Chapter 1. But we can look at the double layers in the abdominal cavity. These are the peritoneums. Double layer around the lungs. You have 2 separate pleural cavities because you have 2 lungs. And the pericardium surrounds the heart. And the reason we were looking at skin and mucous membranes is these are some of the barriers of the body. We have our dry, wet membrane, serous membranes. These are mechanical barriers. They're the first line of defense for pathogens. They keep things out. If you break the first line of defense, then things can get into deeper tissues, like connective tissues, maybe to muscle, maybe into organs or other areas. So cilia, stomach acids, these barriers, there really are protection against pathogens, and pathogens are anything that cause disease. But what happens when the barrier or these other methods don't hold up? For example, when a barrier is penetrated, when bacteria get into your body, well, then it's time for the inflammatory and their immune response. And in A&P2, you will go into a lot of detail about this inflammatory immune response. But we want to get the basics in A&P1. So inflammation is the first step. It's really nonspecific. It's a mechanism that develops quickly wherever tissues are injured, at the site of location. It's a local response. Then you have the immune response, which is extremely specific. It's going to involve immune cells, but because it's specific, it has to be primed. It takes a lot longer to swing into action. There are 2 types of repair at a site of injury. The cells can either regenerate or they can fibrose. Regeneration means the same type of tissue cell is going to replace any damaged tissue cells. So that means that once the original tissue has been replaced after being destroyed, function to that tissue should be restored. Fibrosed tissue is a connective tissue, and if we can't replace the destroyed tissue with the same type of tissue, scar tissue forms. So fibrosed tissue is scar tissue, and fibrosed tissue as a type of connective tissue does not have the same function as all other types of tissue. For example, if you have to repair the heart after a heart attack, when the heart repairs itself, it repairs itself with fibrosed tissue, meaning part of the heart's function will be lost. And if enough of the heart's function is lost after a heart attack because of cell death or myocardial infarction, then the heart ceases to function, and that would cause death. So fibrosed tissue is scar tissue, regenerated tissue is replaced tissue. But which of these occurs depends on the tissue type. Some tissues have really great regenerative capability, like epithelial tissue. Others have poor regenerative capability, like heart tissue or cardiac muscle. So let's look at the steps in tissue repair. Step 1 is going to be inflammation, because again, inflammation sets the stage for repair. And that begins with a release of inflammatory chemicals, kind of like a chemical alarm system. And part of that alarm system involves the release of histamine, which is a vasodilator that dilates blood vessels. And histamine also causes an increase in vessel permeability. And if you dilate blood vessels and increase vessel permeability, more stuff rushes to the area of infection or damage and then can leave the blood and go into tissue. So those 2 things are great. At this site of injury, clotting can occur thanks to platelets and proteins found in blood plasma, and that would be a positive feedback system. So this is what's occurring kind of initially, the inflammation that's setting the stage. We have a cut that started to scab over, blood clotting is occurring, inflammatory chemicals have been released, they cause vasodilation and increased vascular permeability, so things leave the blood and can move into tissue. So great first step. Step 2 is organization. So inflammation first, organization second. So you have to call all the stuff to the area during the inflammation stage. Now we're going to organize it. So eventually the blood clot will be replaced by granulation tissue. Granulation tissue is generally considered also scar tissue, so maybe it might be regenerative cells. Epithelium will begin to regenerate in areas where it can regenerate. Granulation tissue is found more in tissues that have poor regenerative capabilities. In connective tissues, fibroblasts would produce collagen fibers to help regenerate or kind of bridge the gap between damaged tissue and healthy tissue. And then neutrophils and macrophages in the area that have been able to get to the area because of the increased permeability in step 1 of blood vessels will not only be in that tissue, but now start to phagocytose cell debris and any pathogens that may have gotten into a cut or injury. So first we had inflammation that set the stage. Second was organization restores the blood supply. So we will not only fix the damaged tissue, but also encourage new vascularization. The process of generating new blood vessels is termed angiogenesis. And then step 3 is going to be regeneration and fibrosis affect permanent repair, or basically the end of the line. We're going to either have regenerative cells or scar tissue form. So after a scab detaches, you would have either regenerative epithelial cells or maybe fibrosed connective tissue, maybe both. For example, if we're talking about damage to the skin, there's epithelium on top, but there's connective tissue below. So depending on the type of tissues that are available in that area, they may have repaired themselves differently. So skin's a great example for what we've been looking at because it has both, and we can see how both regenerative capabilities and fibrosis capabilities compare. So first we had inflammation, which set the stage. Then we had organization, which reformed blood supply. And then last, there's going to be regeneration and fibrosis, or if we're looking at a simpler injury, maybe just regeneration or maybe just fibrosis. So the fibrosed area would mature and contract in order to bring the healthy layers back together. But in a fibrosed scar tissue area, again, that tissue is never going to fully regenerate or have the same function. Sometimes it's not a big deal, such as like an areolar connective tissue, which is what we're seeing here, dense fibrous and areolar. But in the heart, this could be very damaging if function does not return. But then up here in the epithelial layer, we can see fully regenerated epithelium. Depending on what happened below the fully regenerated epithelium, there may be a divot or a scar, but the cells themselves in the epithelial layer regenerated, and the scar is due to the damaged fibrosed area in the connective tissue, or any tissue that does not regenerate well. So let's talk about tissues that regenerate well versus those that don't. These are the ones that regenerate very well. Epithelium, mucosae, which is basically wet epithelium, bone, areolar connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, and blood-forming tissue. So pretty much all the tissues with a great blood supply are the ones that regenerate well. Some moderate regeneration is seen in smooth muscle and dense regular connective tissue. Not as good blood supply there, like dense regular is around joints. It's hard to get blood to joints in certain locations, especially because they bend and move a lot and kind of pinch blood vessels. Then you have weak regeneration in skeletal muscle and cartilage. Remember, cartilage has no blood supply, so it's avascular. And skeletal muscle has a good blood supply, but it's very organized, and disrupting the organization is hard to repair. And then cardiac muscle and nervous tissue, no regeneration whatsoever. There is a little bit of new research showing that some cell division does occur in these tissues, but definitely need efforts or more research to learn about ways to make them regenerate better, because cardiac muscle, nervous tissue, and damage are some of the major ways that injury can cause death if they injure these tissues. And then we won't do a lot of developmental biology in this class, so I'll just do a short little mini lesson. The epithelium, nervous, muscle, and connective tissue, as the 4 major groups of tissue, come from early cell types. Those cell types exist before you're born. So, for example, in a 16-day-old embryo, there are 3 types or layers in an embryo. Those are ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. Think of them as outside, middle, and inside layer. The epithelium is going to form from all three of those layers. The nervous tissue forms only from the ectoderm, which at one point folds inwards, and that creates a neural tube, which eventually becomes the dorsal cavity of the brain and spinal cord. Then you have muscle and connective tissue, which you can think of more as kind of middle tissues in the body, and those middle tissues are formed from the middle mesoderm. There's epithelium all over the body, so it also should make sense that it's going to form from all three layers. A quick clinical or homeostatic imbalance I want to mention is that scar tissue or fibrosed tissue can also form in organs, and if it forms in areas like the heart, it can impair the function, so myocardial infarction can be dangerous. It can reduce heart function, or it can cause death if enough of the heart is damaged. Because it causes the heart to lose volume capacity, because fibrosed tissue does not contract like cardiac muscle tissue, and that could cause substances to be blocked from moving through the organ. And the organ isn't as important as the heart. That's very dangerous. And it could have impaired nerve transmissions. There's certain pathways in the heart that ensure the signal goes from the atria to the ventricles, and if that is damaged, it could remove those pathways, and that could also lead to death. There are also scar adhesions that could occur if you have injuries near serosae. Say, for example, if the serosae starts sticking together because of the fibrosed tissue and the way it healed, that could prevent normal functions of organs such as your lungs. But that could also affect the heart, because the heart's also surrounded by a serous membrane, the pericardium, for example. And that is it for Chapter 4, so make sure to go back and review all parts. Make sure to look at epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue.